This is Hidden Killers Week in Review.
A look back at the most prolific stories of the week.
This is Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. Here now, Tony Bruschi.
There was a window, brief, narrow. After nearly 36 years, Lyle and Erik Menendez stood closer than ever to the possibility of freedom. Not a commutation, not a headline-grabbing campaign, a real, lawful shot at walking out of the gates. We covered it right here. There were no more barriers, it seemed, at least for a little while. Of course, they were no longer the fresh-faced young men who stunned the world in the early 1990s. Their case, once a tabloid mainstay, had become institutional. Two men aging behind bars, quietly working towards redemption as the world moved on. But the legal tides, they shifted. And for the first time since their sentencing, the system agreed to take a second look. What followed wasn't just a parole hearing, it was a reckoning. And when it ended, that door slammed shut again. Not because of the murders, not entirely, but because of everything that came after. At least that's what the prison system is telling us. So, let's walk through it. Why did Lyle and Erik not succeed at walking out of prison as everyone thought they were going to last year, and then throughout this year, and then it just didn't happen? Let's go through it. It started as many late-stage appeals do, with timing. The brothers had filed a habeas petition years earlier arguing for a new trial based on newly surfaced abuse allegations and documentation. At the center was a 1988 letter Erik had written to his cousin, hinting at what he claimed were years of SA at the hands of their father, Jose Menendez. The letter sat undiscovered for decades until it reemerged in 2018. There was also a separate allegation from Roy Rossellio, a former Menudo member. Remember the Menudo band? Who claimed he, too, had been abused by Jose. None of it had been part of the original trial record. The defense argued that these revelations, they had been presented to jurors in the 1990s. They could have been, or they could have supported a lesser conviction or even a hung jury if they had been presented. If you remember, we go all the way back. The first trial, some of it was. Some of it didn't even exist yet. But then the second trial, none of it got in. Okay? There's that aspect of it. We're not here to relitigate the whole thing and re-explain the whole thing. We're here to explain why they didn't get parole this time. In September 2025, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge William Ryan issued a firm denial. He found that the evidence, while perhaps emotionally powerful, wouldn't have changed the verdict. It didn't prove imminent peril. That's a key legal standard in imperfect self-defense or crimes of passion. Abuse alone doesn't reduce murder to manslaughter, not unless there's a clear and present threat of death or serious harm at the time of the act. And Ryan concluded that the murders of Jose and Kitty Menendez by shotgun blasts in their living room were not acts of reactive panic. They were, in the court's view, planned executions. With the habeas petition denied, attention shifted to a different area, parole. And here, the story takes a turn. In May of 25, Los Angeles Judge Michael Jessic resentenced the brothers. Under California's evolving youth offender laws, which allow for second looks at life sentences handed down to offenders under the age of 26, he converted their punishment from life without parole to 50 years to life. That single ruling had changed everything. That meant after 35 years, the Menendez brothers were eligible to go before the California Parole or Board of Parole hearings immediately. It was their time. The hearings were scheduled for late August. They'd be held separately. Erik on the 21st, Lyle on the 22nd, each appearing by video from Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. Do you want your name attached to a correctional facility? I'm curious. Let me know in the comments. It's like, we're going to name the building after you. And what is it? A prison? It almost seems like a punishment. I don't know. I don't know. Although I guess if you're like the warden there forever, maybe that's, it's all about perspective. At a glance, they seemed like strong candidates. Both had clean records in recent years. Both had pursued higher education, participated in programming, even mentored younger inmates. Erik had completed multiple degrees. Lyle had remained married for over 2 decades to a woman he met through prison correspondence. Their institutional files included positive evaluations from staff and evidence of remorse. But that wasn't the whole story. The parole board saw something else. Let's start with Erik. His hearing lasted over 10 hours. Extraordinary by parole standards. He spoke at length about his childhood, his fears, his decisions. He took the panel through the lead up to the murders, his mental state at the time, and how he'd tried to make sense of what happened over the years. He admitted that he'd failed to report the abuse before the murders, that he lied repeatedly after, that he went shopping, spent lavishly, helped dispose of evidence. He described all of it as shameful, and yet the board pushed harder. Not on what he did back then, but on what he'd done since. Because despite the clean stretch in recent years, Erik's disciplinary history inside prison was long. Over the decades, he'd racked up more than a dozen rule violations. Some were relatively minor, unauthorized tobacco, for example. Others are more serious. Contraband, cell phones, unauthorized communications. At one point, his visiting privileges were suspended after what the board described as inappropriate contact with a visitor more than once. He was found to be circumventing institutional procedures, as they put it. To the parole board, these weren't harmless infractions. They were patterns, and patterns matter. When asked why he'd broken the rules, Erik said what many long-term inmates say, hopelessness. That back when parole seemed impossible, he reached for connection, not thinking about consequences. That the phone gave him a sliver of the freedom in a life otherwise stripped of it. But it wasn't enough for the board. One of the commissioners cut through. You're not here because of what you did in 1998. You're here because of what you've done in prison. Just like that, parole was denied. 3 more years, minimum. He'll be eligible again in 2028 unless he successfully petitions to advance the hearing, which California law allows if there's a significant change in circumstance. But those petitions are hard to win, especially in cases like this. The board was clear. He hadn't crossed the threshold of trust. Then came Lyle. His hearing was shorter, followed the same arc. He too expressed remorse. He too admitted to the lies, the selfishness, the failure to seek help in a way that could have prevented the killings. He talked about his journey, years of reflection, therapy, leadership roles in prison. He acknowledged his role in convincing Erik not to confess. He owned it. But once again, the board zeroed in on institutional behavior. Lyle had a contraband record, too, several cell phone infractions, unapproved communication, and something else. The board flagged what they described as ongoing impulsivity and underlying traits of manipulation. It wasn't that he hadn't grown, it was that the growth hadn't yet outweighed the lingering signs of risk. The commissioners concluded that Lyle, like his brother, still presented a danger. Not in the sense that he would reoffend violently, necessarily, but that he hadn't met the full burden of transformation. He, too, was denied. I'm not here to say right or wrong. I'm just telling you what happened. Both men had walked through the door, and both had it shut behind them. And here's where we pause, because this was the part most people misunderstand. Parole is not about whether someone deserves to be free. It's not about whether they served enough time. It's about risk, pure and simple. The standard is whether the person, if released today, poses an unreasonable danger to public safety. In California, that burden is on the inmate. The presumption is not in their favor, even after decades. Even after good behavior. Parole boards look at conduct, insight, candor, support, networks, and release plans. They also look at past violations. And in high-profile cases, they look at them very closely. This wasn't a political decision, is what they're, trying to spin. The parole board is not the governor or the DA or whoever. It's an independent board. It wasn't about the notoriety of the crime. It was about whether two men, now in their 50s, had convincingly demonstrated that they had shed every trace of the entitlement, impulsivity, and deception that got them there in the first place. And in the board's eyes, they hadn't. And so the question becomes, what now? There are three possible paths forward. The first is the standard one: wait the 3 years, come back in 2028 and try again, build a stronger case, avoid any violations, solidify support networks, demonstrate a deeper level of reflecting and planning. The second path is to petition to advance. Under California law, an inmate who is denied parole can file for an early hearing if they can show a material change. New programming, new psychological insight, a meaningful reduction in risk. These petitions can be filed after 18 months, but the bar is high, especially for individuals with recent rule violations or lingering concerns about candor. The third path, clemency. Governor Gavin Newsom, or any governor after him, holds the power to commute a sentence. That means shortening it, altering it, or even making parole possible sooner. Back in 2024, the Menendez brothers had filed a clemency petition. Newsom's office initially requested a comprehensive risk evaluation. But after the resentencing made them parole eligible, the governor suspended that process, letting the parole system take its course. Now that both have been denied, the clemency petition could theoretically be revived. But the political optics are challenging. Granting clemency in a double murder case, especially one involving wealthy perpetrators, complex family dynamics, and intense public scrutiny, would be a risk few governors would take lightly. There's also the appeal route. The September habeas ruling can be challenged in the California Court of Appeals, but the chances are slim. The appellate court will not reevaluate the facts. They will only consider whether the lower court made a legal error, and Judge Ryan's ruling was thorough. He acknowledged the abuse claims. He accepted them to an extent, but he found that they didn't change the core truth. The murders were premeditated. So the best, most likely shot the brothers have is to walk back into the parole room again, clean, consistent, and ready to convince the board that every red flag has been extinguished. And that might take time. The board isn't asking for perfection, but it is asking for certainty. For signs that Erik and Lyle Menendez, who existed in 1989 and in the decades after, no longer exist in any sort of meaningful way. The scary signs they were capable of doing what they did. That's the price of freedom. Not just time, but trust. And here's a deeper truth most people will miss. The murders of Jose and Kitty Menendez were always going to make parole difficult. But it was the years that followed, the cell phones, the rule breaking, the occasional minimization, that sealed the denials. It would have likely been this way for many other people as well. Because parole isn't about the worst thing someone's done. It's about whether they've become someone who would never do it again. That's what failed in 2025. Not their argument, not their remorse, their proof. If another shot comes, it will be judged by what happens now, in silence in the day-to-day. Whether they follow every rule, whether they take responsibility in full, whether they let their transformation become undeniable, even though I think to many it already is. That's what the parole boards demand. And if ethical, should operate that way. Not transformation in theory, but transformation in evidence. And unless they can show it without loopholes, without excuses, without fallback patterns, then 2028 may look a lot like 2025. A door briefly open, quietly shut, or a door that opens to a new life. The system will go on either way. Give me your thoughts in the comments section on YouTube. If you're not already there, search Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi, and you'll find us on YouTube. Search that wherever you get podcasts as well. And press subscribe. Until next time, I am Tony Bruschi. We'll talk again.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Bruschi and the Hidden Killers podcast.